The fluorescent lights above the military processing station hummed with the relentless buzz of institutional indifference, casting harsh shadows across Emily Johnson's weathered face as she stood motionless in line. Her civilian clothes of faded denim, jacket over worn khakis, marked her as an outsider among the crisp uniforms surrounding her. The fabric of her jacket carried the salt-tinged scent of ocean air, a reminder of morning walks along distant shores that seemed like another lifetime now. Preparing and narrating this type of story takes a lot of time and effort. If you like the story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you want to watch every story of our channel, turn on the bell icon. Next, barked Sergeant Martinez from behind bulletproof glass, his voice cutting through the low murmur of conversations and shuffling feet. The processing center at Naval Station Norfolk stretched before them like a sterile maze of checkpoints, metal detectors, and bureaucratic barriers designed to separate the worthy from the unwelcome. Emily stepped forward, her movements deliberate and measured despite the tremor in her hands, a tremor that had nothing to do with nervousness and everything to do with the medication she'd been prescribed for injuries that had never fully healed. The concrete floor beneath her feet was polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the harsh overhead lighting and the faces of those waiting behind her. She could feel their eyes boring into her back, measuring her, judging her civilian appearance against their polished military bearing. Purpose of visit? Martinez's tone suggested he'd asked this question 10,000 times before, each repetition wearing away another layer of patience. "I'm here to attend the Memorial Day ceremony," Emily said quietly, her voice carrying an unexpected steadiness that contrasted with her humble appearance. "I have authorization." Martinez barely glanced up from his computer screen, his fingers already moving to the next box on his digital checklist. "ID and authorization documents." He extended his hand with the practiced efficiency of someone who had processed countless visitors, contractors, and family members seeking entry to one of the Navy's most prestigious installations. Emily reached into her jacket pocket, her fingers finding the worn leather wallet that had traveled with her across 3 continents and through more military bases than she cared to count. The leather was soft with age, darkened at the edges where her hands had gripped it during countless similar encounters. Inside, nestled between a driver's license and a credit card worn thin from use, was a single piece of paper crisp despite its travels, bearing official letterhead and a signature that most people would never have occasion to see. As she handed over her documents, a young Marine corporal named Davidson approached from the side, his dress blues immaculate despite the early hour. He was perhaps 22, with the kind of earnest face that suggested he still believed in the absolute nature of military hierarchy. His presence drew curious glances from others in line, particularly from a Navy Lieutenant Commander named Chen, who had been waiting to escort a group of foreign dignitaries through the day's events. "Excuse me, ma'am," Davidson said, his voice carrying the particular brand of polite authority that military personnel perfected when addressing civilians. "Are you Emily Johnson?" The question hung in the air like smoke, drawing attention from others in the processing line. A civilian contractor named Bob Williams, there to perform maintenance on the base's communication systems, paused in his conversation with a fellow technician. An elderly woman named Margaret Foster, widow of a Navy captain and herself a frequent visitor to military memorials, looked up from the folding chair where she'd been, waiting with the patient dignity of someone accustomed to military procedures. "Yes, I am," Emily replied, her response simple and direct. There was something in her posture, a subtle straightening of her shoulders, a slight lift of her chin, that suggested depths beneath her unremarkable exterior. Davidson's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the kind of change that occurred when training collided with unexpected circumstances. He glanced toward Martinez, then back to Emily, clearly wrestling with some internal protocol. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step aside for additional screening." The words fell across the processing center like stones dropped into still water. creating ripples of attention and curiosity. Lieutenant Commander Chen moved closer, her diplomatic instincts sensing a situation that might require intervention. Margaret Foster adjusted her position in her chair, decades of military life having taught her to recognize the subtle signs of brewing conflict. Emily's response was measured, neither resistant nor acquiescent. "May I ask what this concerns?" "Routine security procedures," Davidson replied, but the flush creeping up his neck suggested there was nothing routine about his current discomfort. He gestured toward a separate area marked off by portable barriers and additional security equipment. "If you'll just follow me." "Ma'am." Martinez looked up from his computer screen for the first time since Emily had approached, his expression shifting from bored efficiency to active interest. The authorization documents Emily had provided lay scattered across his desk, their official seals and signatures creating a puzzle he was only beginning to piece together. One document, in particular, seemed to be causing him confusion, a letter bearing letterhead from the Pentagon, with security classifications and reference numbers that fell outside his usual experience. "Is there a problem with my documentation?" Emily asked, her voice maintaining its steady calm even as the situation around her began to escalate. She could feel the weight of attention from everyone in the processing center, could sense the ripple of curiosity and judgment that her civilian appearance had triggered among the uniformed personnel. Davidson's radio crackled to life, the static-laden voice of his supervisor requesting an update on the civilian situation. The phrase stung, reducing Emily to nothing more than a procedural complication, a disruption in the smooth flow of military efficiency. Around them, the business of the processing center continued. Other visitors moved through their checkpoints. Security personnel maintained their posts, and the institutional machinery of military bureaucracy ground forward with relentless precision. But something had changed in the atmosphere, a subtle tension that Lieutenant Commander Chen was the first to recognize. Her diplomatic training had taught her to read situations, to sense when undercurrents of misunderstanding might bloom into larger problems. She approached Davidson with the careful grace of someone accustomed to navigating delicate situations. "Corporal, perhaps I might assist with this matter," she offered, her voice carrying the authority of rank tempered with discretion. "I'm familiar with the protocols for today's ceremony." Davidson's relief was palpable, the burden of decision-making shifting to more experienced shoulders. But as Chen examined the documents Martinez had been struggling to categorize, her expression underwent a transformation that Emily watched with growing resignation. It was a look she'd seen before, in processing centers and security checkpoints. Across the world, the moment when her civilian appearance collided with the reality of who she actually was. The morning sun slanted through the high windows of the processing center, casting long rectangles of light across the polished floor. Outside, the naval base was coming to life with the organized chaos of a major ceremonial event. Honor guards were taking their positions. Dignitaries were arriving in black sedans with small flags fluttering from their antennas, and somewhere in the distance, a military band was running through practice scales that drifted on the morning breeze. Emily stood in the center of it all, surrounded by questioning voices and uncertain procedures, her presence somehow managing to disrupt the careful choreography of military precision. Her hands remained steady as she waited, her eyes reflecting neither anger nor impatience, but something deeper, the kind of patience that came from years of understanding that appearances could be deceiving, that assumptions were dangerous, and that the truth had a way of surfacing despite the best efforts of bureaucracy to bury it. The worn leather wallet in her jacket pocket contained more than just identification documents. Hidden in a separate compartment, protected by time and careful handling, was a small piece of metal tarnished with age, but still recognizable to anyone who understood its significance. It was a simple thing, unremarkable to casual observation, but it carried the weight of decisions made under impossible circumstances, of leadership exercised when the stakes couldn't have been higher. of sacrifices that had cost more than anyone should be asked to pay. As the confusion around her deepened, as radio calls were made and supervisors were consulted, Emily Johnson stood quietly in the harsh fluorescent light of the processing center and waited for the truth to surface. She had learned, over the years, that patience was often the most powerful weapon in her arsenal, that silence could speak louder than protest, and that sometimes the most profound revelations came from the most unexpected places. The question that hung unspoken in the air, the mystery that would soon unfold in ways that would shock everyone present, was simple. Who exactly was Emily Johnson? And why did her presence at a routine Memorial Day ceremony have the power to turn a well-oiled military bureaucracy inside out? Close enough that she could hear the waves on stormy nights, but far enough from the tourist areas to maintain the privacy she'd cultivated like a protective wall around her new existence. To claim the sand with their umbrellas and children's laughter, apartment itself reflected a life lived in careful compartments. The main living area was sparse but comfortable, furnished with pieces that suggested function over sentiment. A single bookshelf held an eclectic collection, military histories sat beside poetry collections, technical manuals and novels about ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. The walls were largely bare, except for a single framed photograph of a sunset over water, taken from the deck of what appeared to be a naval vessel. No military memorabilia cluttered the surfaces. No photographs of ceremonies or commendations drew attention to past achievements. But in the bedroom, hidden in the bottom drawer of a simple wooden dresser, lay the remnants of another life entirely. Carefully folded uniforms wrapped in protective plastic. Commendations and citations stored in acid-free boxes. Letters of gratitude from government officials whose names appeared regularly in history books. And at the very bottom, nestled in tissue paper like a sleeping bird, the single item that defined everything she had been and everything she had chosen to leave behind. A set of insignia that would have commanded immediate respect in any military installation in the world. The transformation from that life to this one had not been smooth. Emily's mornings often began with the phantom weight of responsibility pressing against her chest, the muscle memory of command decisions that had affected thousands of lives. She would stand at her kitchen window, watching seagulls wheel over the apartment complex's parking lot, and feel the echo of bridge duty, the constant awareness of weather patterns, strategic positions, and the lives depending on her judgment. The coffee mug in her hands weighed nothing compared to the decisions she once carried. But some mornings the comparison left her feeling hollow. Her neighbors knew her as a quiet woman who kept to herself but could be counted on in small emergencies. Mrs. Rodriguez, from 4B, had learned to knock on Emily's door when her grandson needed help with math homework that had stumped the entire family. Emily would sit at her small dining table, patiently working through algebra problems with the kind of methodical approach that suggested either excellent teaching experience or the kind of analytical thinking that military service developed. She never mentioned which. The grocery store cashier, a young man named Tyler who was working his way through community college, had grown accustomed to Emily's weekly shopping pattern. She bought simple, practical foods ingredients rather than processed meals, as if cooking from scratch was both meditation and necessity. Tyler had noticed her reading while she waited in line, often thick books about leadership or maritime history. But when he'd tried to strike up conversations about her interests, she deflected with questions about his studies, his goals, his plans for the future. It was this gift, the ability to draw others out while revealing nothing of herself, that had served Emily well in her previous life and continued to protect her in this one. At the Veterans Administration Medical Center, where she received treatment for service-related injuries, the staff knew her as a patient who followed instructions precisely, asked intelligent questions, and never complained despite obvious discomfort. Dr. Patricia Williams, who managed Emily's care for chronic pain related to an old back injury, had noted in her files that the patient displayed exceptional composure and unusual familiarity with medical terminology, but Emily had never volunteered information about how she'd acquired either trait. The weekly physical therapy sessions were perhaps the most challenging part of Emily's routine. The exercises designed to maintain mobility in joints damaged by years of shipboard life forced her to confront the physical cost of her service in ways that sitting quietly in her apartment did not. Marcus Thompson, her physical therapist, was a former Army medic who recognized the signs of someone who had pushed their body beyond normal limits in service of duty. But he'd learned not to probe. Emily would perform each exercise with military precision, counting repetitions in a voice that suggested she'd once used the same tone to issue orders. But she never elaborated on the circumstances that had necessitated the therapy. The contradictions in her daily life created a complex portrait that those around her could sense but never quite decode. She moved through the world with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, yet she lived in careful anonymity. She possessed knowledge that surfaced in unexpected moments, the ability to assess weather patterns with uncanny accuracy, an encyclopedic understanding of international maritime law, the kind of strategic thinking that made her a formidable chess opponent at the community center. But she shared these capabilities sparingly, like someone rationing precious resources. Her dreams were the only place where the careful compartmentalization broke down. In sleep, Emily found herself back on the bridge of the USS Constellation, watching storm systems develop on radar screens while making calculations that would keep 800 souls safe through the night. She dreamed of standing in the Pentagon, briefing officials whose faces she could no longer recall, but whose questions had demanded answers that could reshape international policy. Most frequently, she dreamed of a moment frozen in time, standing on a windswept deck, looking out over waters that stretched to the horizon, feeling the weight of stars on her shoulders that had been earned through decisions no one should have to make. The phone calls came monthly, always from the same number, always at the same time. Emily would let them ring 3 times before answering with a simple, "Hello." The conversations were brief, professional, tinged with the kind of respect that years of separation couldn't diminish. "Ma'am, just checking in. Everything secure?" And Emily would respond with equal brevity, "All quiet here. Thank you for calling." These exchanges, no more than 30 seconds each, were the only remaining threads connecting her present life to her past service, carefully maintained, lifelines that both sides seemed to need. Memorial Day ceremony at Naval Station Norfolk represented something different, not an emergency that demanded her attention or a crisis that required her unique expertise, but a voluntary return to a world she had deliberately left behind. The decision to attend had not come easily. Emily had sat at her kitchen table for 3 evenings, staring at the official invitation that had arrived in her mailbox with no return address, but bearing seals and signatures that spoke of authority at the highest levels. The invitation itself was unremarkable, a request for her presence at a ceremony, honoring naval service members who had made the ultimate sacrifice. But the personal note, scrawled at the bottom in familiar handwriting, had changed everything. Your presence would honor them all. Please come. J.K. The J.K. belonged to Admiral James Kellerman, a man whose career had paralleled Emily's own in ways that few people were cleared to understand. Their paths had crossed during some of the Navy's most challenging operations, moments when traditional command structures had given way to the kind of improvised leadership that determined the success or failure of missions that would never appear in official histories. Kellerman's note represented more than an invitation. It was a recognition of service that had been deliberately obscured, an acknowledgement of contributions that had been classified beyond public recognition. Preparing for the ceremony had required Emily to confront aspects of herself that she'd carefully buried. The simple act of pressing her dress uniform had triggered muscle memories of countless mornings spent in preparation for duties that carried the weight of national security. The fabric still fit, though perhaps not as precisely as it once had, and the insignia that transformed her from an anonymous, retiree into someone whose presence would command immediate attention, felt heavier than she remembered. Standing in front of her bathroom mirror, wearing the uniform that represented the pinnacle of her professional achievement, Emily had seen a stranger looking back at her. The woman in the reflection bore the marks of years and hard decisions, but she also carried herself with the unmistakable bearing of someone who had stood at the intersection of history and duty, and chosen to step forward rather than aside. The contradiction between that woman and the quiet retiree who fed seagulls on Virginia Beach created a tension that Emily knew she would carry with her through whatever lay ahead. The drive to Naval Station Norfolk had been a journey through more than geography. Each mile had brought Emily closer to a world she'd thought she'd left permanently behind, a realm of protocols and hierarchies and life-and-death decisions that civilian life had gradually helped her forget. But as the familiar landmarks of military installation came into view, the razor wire and guard posts, the flags snapping in the morning breeze, the ordered chaos of a major ceremonial event, Emily felt the old alertness returning, the situational awareness that years of command had made as natural as breathing. Now, standing in the processing center with her civilian clothes marking her as an outsider despite the authorization documents that should have guaranteed her passage, Emily found herself caught between two worlds. The quiet retiree who had built a life of deliberate anonymity was being challenged by circumstances that threatened to expose the highly classified truth of who she had been and what she had accomplished. The tremor in her hands, which she'd attributed to medication and age, might have been something else entirely, the anticipation of stepping back into a role she'd thought she'd surrendered forever. Morning sun continued its climb outside the processing center windows, marking time until a ceremony that would honor the fallen and perhaps finally acknowledge sacrifices that had been hidden in classified files for years. Emily Johnson stood at the center of growing confusion, her presence creating ripples in the military bureaucracy that no one quite understood. But beneath her calm exterior, beneath the careful compartmentalization that had allowed her to build a new life, the woman who had once commanded respect at the highest levels of naval service was beginning to stir, preparing for a revelation that would shock everyone who thought they knew who she was, and the kind of institutional furniture that prioritized function over comfort. A metal folding chair sat positioned precisely in the center of the space, while a small desk held scanning equipment and a computer terminal that hummed with the electronic vigilance of modern security protocols. The air carried the antiseptic scent of military cleanliness, overlaid with the tension that accumulated in spaces designed for uncomfortable conversations. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to empty all your pockets," Davidson said, his voice carrying the strain of someone following procedures he didn't entirely understand. His hands moved nervously as he activated the scanning equipment, the kind of advanced detection systems typically reserved for high-security clearance situations rather than routine Memorial Day visitors. "Place everything on the desk, please." Emily complied without protest, removing items one by one with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to security screenings. Her keys made a soft metallic sound as they hit the desk surface. Her phone, an older model that suggested someone who valued function over features, landed next to them. The leather wallet followed, its worn surface speaking of years of use and careful maintenance. But when she withdrew a small wrapped package from her inner jacket pocket, Davidson's expression shifted to active concern. "What's that, ma'am?" he asked, his hand moving instinctively toward his radio. "Flowers," Emily replied simply. "For the memorial." The package was small, no larger than a prayer book, wrapped in simple brown paper. When Davidson asked her to unwrap it, Emily's movements revealed a single white rose, carefully preserved between protective tissue paper. The flower was pristine despite its travels, its petals still holding the morning dew that suggested it had been cut just hours earlier. But to Davidson, operating from a playbook that treated all unknowns as potential threats, the package represented another anomaly in what was becoming an increasingly complex situation. Behind the glass partition separating the screening area from the main processing center, Lieutenant Commander Chen was engaged in her own struggle with the documentation Emily had provided. The authorization letter, bearing Pentagon letterhead and multiple official seals, contained references to security classifications and operational designations that fell outside Chen's considerable experience. She had served as a diplomatic liaison for 5 years, had managed security protocols for foreign dignitaries and high-ranking military officials, but the combination of codes and signatures on Emily's paperwork suggested connections that reached into levels of government she had never encountered. "Sergeant Martinez," Chen called, her voice carrying the particular urgency of someone who had recognized a situation spiraling beyond normal parameters. "I need you to contact the base commander's office immediately. Tell them we have a classification issue with today's ceremony." Martinez's expression suggested he understood that his routine morning had just become significantly more complicated. The computer terminal in front of him displayed Emily's identification information alongside a growing list of security flags that had been triggered by her documentation. Her driver's license showed an address in Virginia Beach and an unremarkable photograph that could have belonged to any middle-aged woman. But the authorization letter contained reference numbers that, when input into the military's security database, had generated alerts at levels that required supervisory intervention. In the screening room, Davidson was discovering that Emily Johnson's composure remained unshakable despite the escalating scrutiny. She answered his questions with patient directness, providing information without volunteering additional details that might complicate an already complex situation. When he asked about her military service, she confirmed that she was a Navy retiree. When he inquired about the purpose of her visit, she repeated that she had been invited to attend the Memorial Day ceremony. But something in her responses, the precision of her language, the automatic use of military terminology, the subtle authority that crept into her voice, despite her civilian appearance, suggested depths that Davidson was beginning to suspect he was not equipped to navigate. The situation attracted additional attention when Master Chief Patricia Romano arrived to assess what her junior personnel were. Describing as a documentation irregularity, Romano had served in the Navy for 26 years, had seen every type of security situation that military installations could generate, and prided herself on the ability to cut through bureaucratic confusion with the kind of practical experience that came from decades of dealing with the unexpected. She took one look at Emily, sitting calmly in the metal chair while surrounded by increasingly anxious security personnel, and immediately recognized that something about this situation fell outside normal parameters. "What exactly is the nature of the problem?" Romano asked Davidson, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting straight answers to direct questions. Davidson's explanation came out in a rush of nervous details: the unusual authorization documents, the security flags triggered by database searches, the growing list of questions that no one seemed equipped to answer. But as he spoke, Romano's attention was drawn to Emily herself, the way she sat with the straight-backed posture of someone accustomed to command positions, the alertness in her eyes that suggested active assessment of her surroundings, the complete absence of the anxiety or irritation that most civilians displayed when subjected to extended security screenings. "Ma'am," Romano addressed Emily directly, "Master Chief Patricia Romano. May I ask about the nature of your naval service?" Emily's response was measured and respectful. "I served for 28 years. Master Chief, retired in 2019. What was your rate?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. In the Navy, a person's rate defined not just their job specialty, but their place in the complex hierarchy that governed military life. It was the kind of basic information that every sailor could recite automatically, the foundation upon which all other military identification was built. But Emily's answer, when it came, was delivered with the kind of careful precision that suggested she was choosing her words very deliberately. "Surface warfare officer, she said simply. Romano's expression shifted subtly. Surface warfare officers represented the Navy's elite operational leadership, officers who commanded ships and led thousands of sailors through the complex challenges of naval operations. The designation alone suggested a level of responsibility and expertise that made Emily's current treatment seem increasingly inappropriate. But Romano's years of experience had taught her that in the military, assumptions were dangerous and verification was essential. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to make some phone calls to clarify your status," Romano said. "This may take some time." Emily nodded with the patient acceptance of someone who had spent years navigating military bureaucracy. "I understand, Master Chief." As Romano stepped away to begin the process of verification, the screening room filled with the particular tension that accompanied situations where standard procedures had proved inadequate. Davidson remained at his post, but his earlier confidence had been replaced by the uncomfortable awareness that he might be dealing with something far beyond his training or authority. The scanning equipment continued its electronic vigilance, but the real questions surrounding Emily Johnson required answers that no machine could provide. Outside the screening area, Lieutenant Commander Chen was discovering that the phone calls she was making were generating more questions than answers. The Pentagon office listed on Emily's authorization letter confirmed that the document was authentic and that Emily Johnson was indeed authorized to attend the Memorial Day ceremony. But when Chen pressed for additional information about the specific nature of Emily's service or the reason for the high-level authorization, she was politely but firmly told that such information was classified and not available for general distribution. The growing complexity of the paucity of the Kavasa situation began to attract attention from other personnel in the processing center. Bob Williams, the civilian contractor, had been observing the proceedings with the careful interest of someone who spent his professional life navigating the intersection between civilian and military worlds. His work maintaining communication systems for the Navy had given him insights into the layers of classification and security that governed military operations, and he recognized the signs of a situation that involved information far above the clearance levels of the personnel attempting to process it. Margaret Foster, the elderly widow who had been waiting patiently for her own processing, approached Lieutenant Commander Chen with the careful dignity of someone who had spent decades as a military spouse. "Excuse me, dear," she said, her voice carrying the particular authority that came from years of navigating military protocol as an insider. "Is there some difficulty with the young woman?" Chen's response was diplomatically vague, but Margaret's experienced eye had already assessed the situation with the clarity that came from years of observing military procedures. She had seen similar situations during her late husband's career, moments when standard protocols encountered circumstances that required intervention from much higher levels of authority. The careful handling of Emily's documentation, the growing number of phone calls being made, the obvious discomfort of the personnel involved, all of it suggested that Emily Johnson was not the ordinary retiree that her civilian appearance implied. As the morning progressed, the simple task of processing a single visitor for a Memorial Day ceremony had evolved into a complex investigation that was beginning to strain the resources and authority of everyone involved. The base security office had been notified. The ceremonial planning committee had been alerted to a potential delay. Senior personnel who had been preparing for their roles in the day's events were receiving calls asking them to stand by for developments related to an unnamed security consideration. Through it all, Emily Johnson sat quietly in the screening room, her presence somehow managing to disrupt the careful choreography of military efficiency without her making any aggressive moves or unreasonable demands. The white rose she had brought for the memorial lay on the desk beside her other belongings, its pristine petals a stark contrast to the institutional harshness of the screening facility. The flowers seemed to represent something pure and respectful in the midst of growing confusion, a reminder that beneath all the security protocols and verification procedures, Someone was simply trying to honor fallen service members with a gesture of remembrance. But the question that no one had yet been able to answer satisfactorily remained. Who exactly was Emily Johnson? And why did her presence at what should have been a routine ceremony require authorization from the highest levels of military command? The morning sun continued its climb outside the processing center windows, marking time until revelations that would transform everyone's understanding of the quiet woman whose civilian appearance had concealed truths that would soon reshape the entire day's events. The moment Admiral James Kellerman stepped through the main entrance of the processing center, the entire atmosphere shifted like the air pressure change before a storm. His entrance was unannounced, no fanfare, no advanced security detail, just the quiet arrival of someone whose presence commanded immediate attention without requiring formal introduction. He was a man in his early 60s, silver-haired and bearing the kind of weathered dignity that came from decades of naval service at the highest levels. His dress blue uniform carried 4 stars on the shoulder boards, but it was something deeper and unmistakable. Aura of authority earned through command decisions that had shaped international policy that caused every person in the processing center to straighten unconsciously as he passed. Kellerman's eyes swept the scene with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to reading complex situations quickly. He took in the unusual clustering of personnel around the screening area, the obvious tension in the faces of junior officers who had found themselves dealing with circumstances beyond their training, and the careful way Lieutenant Commander Chen was handling what appeared to be sensitive documentation. But his attention focused immediately on the screening room where Emily Johnson sat waiting, her composure intact despite the growing chaos her presence had created. Master Chief Romano. Kellerman's voice carried the particular quality of command that made rank unnecessary for identification. I understand there's been some confusion regarding Ms. Johnson's authorization. Romano snapped to attention with the automatic precision of someone whose military training had become muscle memory. Yes, sir. We've been attempting to verify her credentials, but the documentation contains classifications that are double quotes. She paused, searching for appropriate terminology. Beyond our current access levels. Kellerman's expression remained neutral, but those with experience reading senior officers might have detected the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested carefully controlled emotions. He approached the screening room where Emily remained seated, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap with the patient dignity of someone who had learned to wait while bureaucracy sorted itself out around her. "Hello, Emily," Kellerman said simply, his formal command voice giving way to something warmer, more personal. "I apologize for this misunderstanding." Emily's response was equally simple. "Hello, Admiral." No apology necessary. The exchange was brief, almost mundane, but its implications rippled through the processing center like shock waves. The casual familiarity between the base's senior officer and a woman who had been treated as a security concern suggested connections that everyone present was beginning to recognize they had seriously underestimated. Davidson, who had been maintaining his vigilant position near the scanning equipment, found himself reassessing every assumption he had made about the quiet woman whose presence had created such complications. Kellerman turned to address the assembled personnel, his voice carrying the authority to reshape everyone's understanding of the morning's events. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need to clarify something that should have been apparent from the beginning. You are not dealing with an ordinary visitor to today's ceremony." He gestured toward Emily with the respectful acknowledgement of someone recognizing an equal. "This is Admiral Emily Johnson, United States Navy, retired. Former commanding officer of the USS Constellation, former director of Naval Strategic Operations, and recipient of the Navy Distinguished Service Medal, among other commendations that remain classified." The revelation fell across the processing center like a detonation in slow motion. "Master Chief," Romano's expression shifted from professional alertness to something approaching shock as she realized she had been questioning a fellow senior officer. Lieutenant Commander Chen felt her diplomatic training kick in, her mind rapidly recalculating the political implications of a situation where a retired admiral had been subjected to security screening, typically reserved for potential threats. Davidson, meanwhile, found himself confronting the reality that he had been attempting to process someone whose military rank exceeded his own by distances that made the previous hour's interaction seem almost surreal. But it was the response of the civilian witnesses that perhaps most clearly illustrated the magnitude of the revelation. Bob Williams, the contractor who had observed the proceedings with professional interest, found himself understanding why Emily's authorization documents had contained references that fell outside normal military channels. Margaret Foster, whose years as a military spouse had given her insights into the complex hierarchies that governed naval life, recognized immediately why Emily's bearing and responses had seemed incongruous with her civilian appearance. Emily herself remained seated, her expression revealing neither satisfaction nor irritation at the delayed recognition of her status. When Kellerman gestured for her to stand, she did so with the same measured grace she had maintained throughout the morning's confusion, rising from the metal chair as if it were the captain's seat on a naval vessel rather than furniture in a security screening facility. "Ma'am," Master Chief Romano said, her voice carrying the strain of someone realizing the full implications of the morning's events, "I need to apologize for." Emily raised a hand gently, cutting off the apology with the kind of authority that came from years of command experience. "Master Chief, you were following proper procedures with the information available to you. No apology is necessary." But Romano's distress was evident. The realization that she had subjected a retired admiral to treatment appropriate for a potential security threat, creating the kind of professional embarrassment that would likely follow her for months. The other personnel involved in the morning's processing showed similar reactions. Davidson looked as if he wanted to disappear into the floor, while Sergeant Martinez was rapidly scrolling through computer screens trying to understand how his security systems had failed to identify someone of Emily's rank and clearance level. Admiral Kellerman's voice cut through the growing atmosphere of collective embarrassment. "The fault here lies with classification protocols, not with personnel following appropriate security procedures." He paused, his attention focusing on Emily with the kind of respect reserved for those who had shared experiences at the highest levels of military responsibility. "Admiral Johnson's service record contains information that remains classified at levels requiring special compartmented intelligence clearance. Her presence at today's ceremony was arranged through channels that not everyone here would have access to." The explanation provided context but also raised new questions. Why would a retired admiral's attendance at a Memorial Day ceremony require such high-level clearance? What aspects of her service remained so sensitive that her military rank itself had been obscured in standard databases? And perhaps most intriguingly, what had Emily Johnson done during her active duty career that necessitated the kind of operational security typically reserved for ongoing intelligence operations? Emily's own response to these unspoken questions was characteristically direct. "Admiral Kellerman, if I may, I think some clarification would be helpful for everyone involved." Kellerman nodded, recognizing that the situation had progressed beyond the point where standard military courtesy could smooth over the morning's confusion. "Please." Emily turned to address the assembled personnel, her voice taking on the clarity and authority that had once been used to brief Pentagon officials and international allies. "During my active duty service, I commanded operations that required my identity and rank to be compartmentalized for security reasons. Some of those operations remain classified, which means that my service record in standard military databases reflects only a portion of my actual career." She paused, allowing the implications to settle. The authorization documents I provided this morning were issued through special channels because my presence at today's ceremony relates to classified operations that are finally being acknowledged, albeit in limited ways. The explanation provided answers while simultaneously revealing the complexity of military operations that existed beyond public knowledge. Lieutenant Commander Chen found herself understanding why her diplomatic clearance had been insufficient to verify Emily's status. Davidson began to grasp why the security flags triggered by Emily's documentation had required intervention from levels of authority he had never encountered. Even Sergeant Martinez, whose years of processing military personnel had given him confidence in his ability to navigate any documentation challenge, was confronting the reality that some aspects of military service operated entirely outside his experience. Admiral Kellerman stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of someone authorized to reveal information that had been carefully guarded for years. Her strategic decisions prevented international incidents that could have destabilized entire regions. He paused, his eyes meeting Emily's with the shared understanding of those who had carried burdens too sensitive for public recognition. The USS Constellation, under her command, was involved in operations that required her to make split-second decisions affecting not just American interests, but global maritime security. Her work as Director of Naval Strategic Operations involved coordinating responses to threats that most people will never know existed. The weight of these revelations settled over the processing center like a heavy blanket. Margaret Foster, whose husband had served during the Cold War, recognized the careful language that indicated operations involving national security at the highest levels. Bob Williams found himself reassessing his assumptions about the quiet woman who had an hour of security screening without once invoking the authority that could have ended the situation immediately. But perhaps the most profound reaction came from Master Chief Romano, whose 26 years of naval service had given her deep appreciation for the sacrifices made by those who served in positions of ultimate responsibility. She approached Emily with the respectful bearing of someone recognizing not just superior rank, but superior service under circumstances that demanded more than most people could give. "Ma'am," Romano said, her voice carrying genuine emotion, "on behalf of everyone here, I want to express our gratitude for your service and our sincere apologies for this morning's single quotes confusion." Emily's response revealed the grace that had likely served her well during the most challenging moments of her career. "Master Chief, your personnel performed their duties exactly as they should have. Security protocols exist for good reasons, and I would have been concerned if my presence hadn't triggered appropriate verification procedures." She looked around the processing center, her gaze taking in each person who had been involved in the morning's events. What happened here this morning demonstrates that our security systems work precisely as they're designed to. That's something to be proud of, not apologetic about. The generous response seemed to lift some of the embarrassment that had settled over the junior personnel, but it also revealed something deeper about Emily's character. Here was someone who had commanded at the highest levels of military authority, who had made decisions affecting international stability, who had earned recognition from sources that remained classified years after her retirement. Yet she chose to respond to an hour of uncomfortable scrutiny with understanding rather than indignation, with perspective rather than wounded pride. Admiral Kellerman's watch indicated that the Memorial Day ceremony would begin in less than an hour, and the morning's events had created logistical complications that would require careful management. But something had fundamentally changed in the atmosphere of the processing center. What had begun as a routine security screening had evolved into a moment of recognition, not just of Emily's true identity and rank, but of the complex realities that governed military service at its highest levels. "Ladies and gentlemen," Kellerman announced, "I'm going to ask that the events of this morning be treated with appropriate discretion." Admiral Johnson's presence at today's ceremony represents the recognition of service that has remained classified for operational security reasons. Some aspects of what you've learned here will remain classified. The announcement carried the weight of official guidance, but it also acknowledged that everyone present had become, in some small way, custodians of information that revealed the hidden complexities of military service. They had witnessed the moment when carefully maintained operational security had given way to recognition that was both overdue and necessarily limited. Emily gathered her belongings from the desk where they had been placed for screening, her movements deliberate and unhurried. The white rose, still pristine despite the morning's complications, was wrapped carefully in its protective tissue paper. Her leather wallet, worn smooth by years of use, was returned to her jacket pocket. But when she reached for her authorization documents, Admiral Kellerman intervened. "Emily, I think those documents have served their purpose," he said with a slight smile. "I suspect you won't need them for the rest of today's events." As Emily and Admiral Kellerman prepared to leave the processing center, the assembled personnel found themselves witnesses to a transformation that went beyond the simple revelation of Emily's military rank. They had seen someone who had chosen to build a life of deliberate anonymity, who had endured treatment that could have been avoided with a single phone call, who had responded to misunderstanding with grace rather than authority. The contrast between the quiet woman in civilian clothes who had entered the Q's facility and the retired admiral who was now departing created a lesson in leadership that no training manual could have provided. Lieutenant Commander Chen, whose diplomatic experience had taught her to recognize moments of significance, understood that she had witnessed something rare, the intersection of classified service with public recognition, the moment when operational security gave way to acknowledgement that was both necessary and long overdue. Master Chief Romano knew that the morning's events would become part of the stories she would tell about her naval career, examples of how assumptions could be dangerous and how true service often went unrecognized until circumstances forced revelation. But perhaps it was Corporal Davidson who was most profoundly affected by the morning's revelations. His earnest belief in military hierarchy had been shaken by the discovery that someone whose rank exceeded his own by vast distances had submitted to his authority without protest, had answered his questions with patience rather than indignation, had demonstrated leadership through restraint rather than assertion. The lesson would stay with him throughout his military career, that true authority often disguised itself as humility, and that the most profound service sometimes occurred in silence. As Emily and Admiral Kellerman walked toward the main exit of the processing center, their conversation was too quiet for others to overhear, but their body language spoke of mutual respect earned through shared experience at the highest levels of military responsibility. The morning sun, now climbing toward its ceremonial position for the Memorial Day events, cast long shadows across the facility that had become the setting for revelations that would be remembered long after the day's formal ceremonies had concluded. Behind them, the processing center slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but something fundamental had changed. Every person who had witnessed the morning's events carried away a deeper understanding of the complexities that governed military service, the sacrifices made by those who served in positions requiring absolute discretion, and the grace with which true leaders handled both recognition and its absence. The white rose that Emily carried, intended for a memorial to fallen service members, had become something more, a symbol of service that continued even in retirement, of recognition that came not from public acknowledgement, but from the quiet satisfaction of duty performed under the most demanding circumstances. As Emily Johnson finally left the processing center that had detained her for over an hour, she carried with her not just the flower intended for today's ceremony, but the respect of everyone who had learned that appearances could be profoundly deceiving and that the most significant service often occurred far from public view. The Memorial Day ceremony at Naval Station Norfolk unfolded with the precision that military events demanded. But beneath the surface protocol, word of the morning's revelations had begun to spread through the attending personnel with the particular velocity that significant news achieved in military communities. Admiral Kellerman had escorted Emily to a position of honor near the memorial wall, where her civilian clothes now seemed less like an anomaly and more like a deliberate choice, the decision of someone who had earned the right to define her own relationship with the uniform she had once worn. The memorial itself was a stunning piece of architecture and remembrance. Black granite walls inscribed with names of naval personnel who had made the ultimate sacrifice, surrounded by carefully maintained gardens where white roses bloomed in precise geometric patterns. The morning sun struck the polished stone at angles that made the engraved names seem to glow with their own inner light, each one representing a life cut short in service to something larger than individual existence. Emily stood before the wall with her single white rose, reading names that included some she remembered from her own service, young officers who had served under her command during operations that remained classified, sailors whose deaths had been mourned in ceremonies that could never fully acknowledge the circumstances that claimed their lives. Her presence at the memorial represented more than personal remembrance. It was recognition that some sacrifices occurred in silence, their significance understood only by those who shared the burden of classified service. As the formal ceremony began, Admiral Kellerman stepped to the podium with the bearing of someone carrying more than ceremonial responsibility. His opening remarks followed traditional patterns: acknowledgement of sacrifice, gratitude for service, commitment to remembering those who could not be present. But when he began to speak about service that occurred beyond public recognition, his words carried additional weight for those who had witnessed the morning's events at the processing center. Today we honor not only those whose names are inscribed on this memorial, Kellerman said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd of active duty personnel, veterans and family members, but also those whose service continues to be protected by necessary classification. Some of the finest examples of naval leadership and sacrifice remain hidden from public view, not because they are less significant, but because their revelation could compromise ongoing operations or endanger those who continue to serve in similar capacities. The words were carefully chosen, acknowledging classified service without revealing specific details. But several people in the audience understood that Kellerman's remarks were particularly relevant to Emily's presence. Master Chief Romano, who had been invited to attend the ceremony despite her involvement in the morning's complications, recognized the graceful way Kellerman was providing context for Emily's true identity without compromising operational security. Lieutenant Commander Chen, standing among the diplomatic corps that had been invited to observe the ceremony, found herself reassessing her understanding of military service. Her work had shown her the complexity of international naval operations, but the morning's revelations had provided insights into levels of classification and responsibility that her diplomatic clearance had never accessed. She was beginning to understand that some aspects of military leadership operated entirely outside the framework she thought she understood. When Emily was invited to place her white rose at the base of the memorial wall, her movement toward the granite drew the attention of everyone present. She walked with the measured grace of someone accustomed to ceremonial responsibilities, but there was something deeper in her bearing, a personal connection to the memorial that went beyond formal respect. As she knelt to place the flower among the other tributes that had been left throughout the morning, her gesture carried the weight of someone who had made decisions that determined whether names would be added to such memorials. The moment of silence that followed was more profound than the usual ceremonial pause. Several hundred people stood in complete quiet, but the silence seemed to acknowledge not just the fallen whose names were visible on the memorial, but also those whose service and sacrifice remained hidden from public recognition. Emily remained kneeling for several heartbeats longer than ceremony required, her head bowed in what appeared to be personal communion with memories that she alone could access. As The formal ceremony concluded, and the assembled crowd began to disperse. Emily found herself approached by people whose morning experiences had created a desire for connection that went beyond normal military courtesy. Corporal Davidson, whose earnest face still showed signs of embarrassment over his role in the processing center complications, approached with obvious nervousness. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the particular strain of someone trying to navigate an unprecedented situation, "I wanted to apologize again for this morning." "I should have." Emily's interruption was gentle but definitive. "Corporal, you performed your duties exactly as you were trained to do. Your attention to security protocols protected everyone on this base, including me." She paused, her eyes meeting his with the kind of direct attention that suggested he had her complete focus. "In my experience, the most dangerous situations develop when security personnel make assumptions rather than following established procedures. You did everything right." The interaction drew the attention of Margaret Foster, who had observed Emily's grace under pressure with the appreciation of someone whose life had been shaped by military service. She approached with the careful dignity that had served her well during decades as a military spouse, her understanding of protocol allowing her to navigate the complex situation of addressing a retired admiral whose rank had been revealed only hours earlier. "Admiral Johnson," Margaret said, her voice carrying respectful warmth, "I wanted to thank you for your service and to tell you that your composure this morning was an inspiration. My late husband always said that true leadership was most evident in how people handled unexpected challenges." Emily's response revealed the personal qualities that had likely served her well during the most demanding moments of her career. "Mrs. Foster, thank you. Your husband was wise, and I suspect he learned that wisdom through experience similar to what we all witnessed today." The conversations that developed around Emily in the aftermath of the ceremony created an informal receiving line of sorts, as personnel who had been involved in the morning's events sought to process their experiences with someone who had been at the center of the confusion. But Emily's responses consistently deflected attention from her own discomfort and focused instead on the professional competence of those who had followed proper procedures despite insufficient information. Bob Williams, the civilian contractor whose work required him to navigate military protocols regularly, found himself discussing the complexity of security clearances with someone whose experience encompassed levels of classification he had only heard described in theoretical terms. "Ma'am, I have to ask, how do you balance the need for operational security with the desire for recognition of service?" Emily's answer revealed depths of consideration that suggested the question had occupied her thoughts for years. "Mr. Williams, I think the most important recognition comes from the knowledge that you've contributed to something larger than yourself. Public acknowledgement is gratifying, but it's not the reason most people choose military service. The real satisfaction comes from knowing that your actions made a difference, even if no one outside a very small circle ever learns about it." As the morning progressed into afternoon, the ripple effects of Emily's revelation began to manifest in ways that would reshape the understanding of several people whose lives had intersected with hers. Master Chief Romano found herself reconsidering assumptions about retirement and civilian life, recognizing that some people carried responsibilities that extended far beyond their official status. Lieutenant Commander Chen was developing insights into the complexity of naval operations that would inform her diplomatic work for years to come. But perhaps the most significant transformation was occurring in Corporal Davidson, whose earnest approach to military service had been deepened by exposure to leadership that operated through example rather than assertion. His interaction with Emily had provided lessons in humility, professionalism, and the kind of grace under pressure that no training manual could adequately describe. Admiral Kellerman, who had orchestrated Emily's invitation to the ceremony, watched these interactions with the satisfaction of someone who had anticipated their significance. The morning's complications had been unplanned, but they had created opportunities for recognition that might not have occurred under normal ceremonial circumstances. Emily's handling of an uncomfortable situation had demonstrated leadership principles that would be remembered and emulated by everyone who witnessed them. As the day's formal events concluded, Emily found herself walking with Admiral Kellerman toward the base commander's quarters, where a small reception was planned for distinguished visitors. Their conversation, private despite occurring in full view of others, seemed to address questions that had been deferred during the public ceremony. "Emily," Kellerman said, his voice carrying the informal warmth that was possible only between equals who had shared similar burdens, "I hope today hasn't been too difficult. I know you value your privacy." Emily's response reflected the kind of philosophical acceptance that suggested she had made peace with the complex relationship between service and recognition. "Admiral, privacy is important, but so is acknowledging the service of others. If my presence here today helps people understand that some military service occurs beyond public view, then temporary discomfort is a fair trade." The statement captured something essential about Emily's character: the willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for broader purpose, the understanding that individual recognition was less important than institutional acknowledgement of hidden service. As they walked through the perfectly maintained grounds of the naval station, their conversation continued to address questions that would influence how similar situations might be handled in the future. Behind them, the memorial wall stood in afternoon sunlight that cast long shadows across the carefully maintained gardens. The white rose Emily had placed among the tributes would remain fresh for several days, its presence serving as a reminder that some service continued long after formal retirement, and that recognition, when it finally came, carried responsibilities that extended far beyond personal satisfaction. Day that had begun with Emily Johnson standing anonymously in a processing line had evolved into something unprecedented, a moment when classified service intersected with public acknowledgement, when operational security gave way to recognition that was both necessary and long overdue. The transformation would be remembered by everyone involved, but its most significant impact might be its demonstration that true leadership often manifested itself in the quiet dignity with which people handled both recognition and its absence. 6 months after the Memorial Day ceremony, Virginia Beach apartment that Emily Johnson called home had undergone subtle but significant changes in the months following her unexpected moment of recognition at Naval Station Norfolk. The same sparse furniture occupied the same positions, the same ocean view stretched beyond her kitchen window, and the same morning routine of coffee and coastal walks continued to structure her days. But something fundamental had shifted in the quality of her privacy and the nature of her civilian existence. The phone calls that had once come monthly now arrived weekly, sometimes more frequently. The conversations remained brief and professional, but they carried a different weight now that Emily's identity was known to a broader circle of military personnel. The callers: active duty officers facing complex strategic decisions, Pentagon officials navigating international incidents, congressional staffers seeking insight into naval operations, approached her with the respectful deference due someone whose classified service had finally received limited acknowledgement. On this particular November morning, as Emily prepared for what had become a regular engagement, she reflected on how recognition had brought both satisfaction and responsibility. The invitation on her kitchen table bore the seal of the Naval War College, requesting her participation in a classified seminar for senior officers dealing with the kind of maritime challenges that had defined her own active duty career. It was the fourth such invitation she had received since Memorial Day, each one representing opportunities to share hard-won expertise with officers who would face similar decisions in their own commands. The drive from Virginia Beach to Newport, Rhode Island, had become familiar over the previous months. Emily had made the trip 5 times, each visit allowing her to contribute to the education of naval officers who were assuming responsibilities similar to those she had carried during her classified operations. The seminars were small, highly classified affairs where she could speak freely about strategic decisions that had shaped international policy, operational challenges that had required improvised solutions, and leadership lessons that could only be learned through experience. At the highest levels of command responsibility, Dr. Rebecca Chen, Lieutenant Commander Chen's sister, as Emily had discovered during one of their chance encounters at a Norfolk coffee shop, had become an unexpected connection to her post-recognition life. Rebecca, a civilian strategic analyst working on maritime security issues, had approached Emily through carefully maintained academic channels, seeking insights for research that would inform policy recommendations at the highest levels of government. Their conversations, conducted over monthly lunches at a quiet restaurant overlooking the Chesapeake Bay, had evolved into a mentoring relationship that provided Emily with intellectual stimulation while offering Rebecca access to strategic thinking that no academic program could provide. The ripple effects of Emily's recognition had extended far beyond her personal circumstances. Master Chief Romano had been selected for assignment to the Pentagon, where her experience with complex security situations had been recognized as valuable preparation for handling classified operations at the highest levels. During her farewell visit to Emily's apartment, Romano had spoken about how the Memorial Day incident had reshaped her understanding of leadership and the importance of following procedures, even when circumstances seemed to suggest exceptions might be appropriate. Corporal Davidson had been promoted to sergeant ahead of normal scheduling, his handling of a complex security situation having demonstrated maturity and judgment that his superiors recognized as exceptional for someone of his experience level. But perhaps more significantly, Davidson had requested assignment to duties involving classified operations, his encounter with Emily having inspired him to seek service that extended beyond routine military responsibilities. In a letter he had sent to Emily 3 months after the ceremony, Davidson had written that her example had taught him that the most important military service often occurred far from public recognition, and that such service required both courage and humility. Lieutenant Commander Chen had been selected for promotion to commander and assignment as a diplomatic liaison to NATO maritime operations. Her experience with classified protocols and her demonstrated ability to navigate complex international situations having been recognized as assets for protocols, and her demonstrated ability to navigate complex international situations having been recognized as assets for increasingly important alliance responsibilities. During a brief visit to Emily's apartment while on leave, Chen had expressed gratitude for lessons learned during what she described as the most educational security screening of my naval career. 2 years after the Memorial Day ceremony, the Naval Academy at Annapolis had extended an invitation that Emily had initially been reluctant to accept. A request to address the graduating class of midshipmen about leadership during classified operations. The invitation had come through Admiral Kellerman, who had argued that the Academy's future officers needed to understand that some of their most important service might never receive public recognition, and that such service required different kinds of preparation than conventional military training provided. Emily's address to the graduating class had been carefully scripted to avoid classified details while providing insights into the psychological and ethical challenges of command, decisions that could never be fully explained or publicly justified. Standing at the podium in Bancroft Hall, facing 800 young officers who would soon assume responsibilities that might include the kind of classified operations that had defined her own career, Emily had felt the weight of passing hard-won wisdom to the next generation of naval leaders. Leadership in classified operations, she had told them, requires a different kind of courage than conventional military service. You must be prepared to make decisions that you cannot explain, to accept responsibility for outcomes that you cannot publicly defend, and to find satisfaction in service that may never receive recognition. outside a very small circle of people who understand its significance. The speech had been recorded for future use in Academy leadership training, making Emily's insights available to successive classes of midshipmen who would graduate into a world where maritime security challenges required the kind of strategic thinking and operational discretion that her career had exemplified. Bob Williams, the civilian contractor whose observation of the Memorial Day Processing Center incident had provided him with unexpected insights into military classification, had leveraged his new understanding into a promotion within his company. His ability to navigate the complex intersection between civilian technology and classified military operations had been recognized as valuable expertise for contracts requiring the highest levels of security clearance. During a chance encounter at a Norfolk hardware store, Williams had told Emily that witnessing her grace under pressure had taught him lessons about professionalism that had reshaped his approach to challenge in work situations. Margaret Foster had become an unofficial ambassador for Emily's story within the military spouse community, sharing carefully edited versions of the Memorial Day incident as examples of how service continued beyond retirement and how recognition often came in unexpected ways. Her bridge club at the Norfolk Officers' Wives Club had become a forum for discussions about the hidden complexities of military life and the importance of supporting service members whose contributions might never receive public acknowledgement. 5 years after the Memorial Day ceremony, the invitation from the Secretary of the Navy had arrived on official letterhead, requesting Emily's participation in a classified review of naval strategic operations during the period of her active duty service. The review, designed to extract lessons learned from operations that had remained classified for national security reasons, would finally allow Emily to discuss her service in detail with officials who possessed appropriate clearances and needed her insights for current strategic planning. The Pentagon meetings that followed had been both cathartic and challenging. For the first time since her retirement, Emily had been able to speak freely about decisions that had shaped international maritime policy, operations that had prevented conflicts that would have destabilized entire regions, and leadership challenges that had required her to balance competing national interests with the safety of her personnel. The classified debrief sessions had stretched across several weeks, each meeting allowing Emily to unpack years of carefully compartmentalized experience. The review's conclusions would remain classified, but Emily had been informed that her insights were being incorporated into strategic planning for current operations facing similar challenges. The knowledge that her experience continued to contribute to national security, even years after her retirement, provided the kind of professional satisfaction that public recognition could never match. During one of her regular walks along Virginia Beach, Emily had encountered a young woman wearing a Naval Academy class ring, who introduced herself as Ensign Sarah Martinez, daughter of Sergeant Martinez, who had processed Emily's documentation during the Memorial Day incident 5 years earlier. The younger Martinez had heard carefully edited versions of the story from her father, and she approached Emily with the respectful curiosity of someone beginning her own naval career. The conversation had lasted over an hour, ranging across topics from leadership philosophy to the challenges of classified operations, from the importance of following procedures to the grace required when those procedures proved inadequate. As they parted, Ensign Martinez had expressed gratitude for insights that her academy training had not provided, and Emily had felt the particular satisfaction that came from knowing that experience, hard-won through years of classified service, was being passed to officers who would face similar challenges. 10 years after the Memorial Day ceremony, the memorial service for Admiral James Kellerman had brought together hundreds of officers whose careers had been influenced by his leadership and vision. Emily's attendance at the service, wearing her dress uniform for the first time since the Memorial Day ceremony that had changed everything, marked her return to full public recognition of her service and achievements. The uniform still fit perfectly. The insignia still carried the weight of decisions made under impossible circumstances. And her presence among the assembled flag officers finally seemed natural rather than revelatory. During the reception following Kellerman's service, Emily had found herself in conversation with officers whose careers spanned the decades since her own retirement. Many of them had heard carefully edited versions of her story through professional channels, and several had sought her guidance during their own commands involving classified operations. The conversations had provided Emily with insights into how naval strategic operations had evolved since her retirement, and how the lessons learned from her service continued to influence current operational thinking. Master Chief Romano, now serving as Command Master Chief at the Pentagon, had approached Emily during the reception with news that would have seemed impossible during their first meeting at the Norfolk Processing Center. The Navy had established a new program for classified leadership development, designed to prepare officers for the kind of strategic responsibilities that Emily's career had exemplified. Romano had been selected to manage the program's implementation, and she had requested Emily's participation as a senior advisor whose experience encompassed the full range of challenges that classified operations could present. The positive program would remain classified, its existence known only to those with appropriate clearances, but its impact would be felt throughout the Navy as successive generations of officers received training that prepared them for service beyond conventional military responsibilities. Emily's acceptance of the advisory role would mark her formal return to active participation in naval strategic operations, albeit in a capacity that recognized both her expertise and her preference for service without public recognition. 15 years after the Memorial Day ceremony, the small gathering in Emily's Virginia Beach apartment represented an informal reunion of people whose lives had been shaped by the events of a single morning that had revealed hidden truths about service, recognition, and the complex relationships between military duty and civilian life. Master Chief Romano, now retired herself, had traveled from her home in San Diego. Commander Chen, recently promoted to captain and serving as a diplomatic attaché in Brussels, had arranged leave specifically to attend. Sergeant Davidson, now a chief warrant officer specializing in classified security operations, had driven down from Norfolk. The conversation that evening had ranged across 15 years of military service, professional achievements, and personal growth that could be traced to lessons learned during the Memorial Day incident that had brought them together. Each person carried stories of how Emily's example had influenced their approach to challenging situations, their understanding of leadership under pressure, and their appreciation for service that occurred beyond public recognition. Emily had served as hostess with the same quiet grace that had characterized her response to the original processing center complications, asking questions about their careers and families while deflecting attention from her own continued service as a classified advisor to naval strategic operations. But as the evening progressed, the conversations had evolved into something deeper, a collective recognition that the morning's events 15 years earlier had provided lessons that continued to influence their professional and personal lives. As her guests prepared to leave, each person had expressed gratitude for insights that extended far beyond military service. Emily's example had taught them that true leadership often manifested itself in quiet dignity rather than dramatic gesture, that the most important service frequently occurred without recognition, and that grace under pressure was both a professional skill and a personal virtue that could be developed through conscious practice. Standing in her doorway, as her guests departed into the Virginia Beach evening, Emily reflected on the unexpected ways that a single morning of bureaucratic confusion had reshaped not just her own life, but the careers and perspectives of everyone involved. The recognition that had finally come had brought responsibilities she had not anticipated, opportunities to contribute that extended far beyond her retirement, and relationships that had enriched her civilian life in ways that compensated for the solitude she had initially sought. The white rose she had carried to the Memorial Day ceremony 15 years earlier had long since withered, but its symbolic significance had grown in ways that Emily could not have predicted. The gesture of remembrance had become a catalyst for recognition that continued to generate opportunities for service, influence that extended across successive generations of naval officers, and relationships that demonstrated the enduring power of leadership exercised through example, rather than authority. As Emily closed her apartment door and prepared for another morning of the routine that structured her days, she carried with her the knowledge that some recognition came slowly, that the most important service often occurred in silence, and that the ripple effects of single moments could reshape lives in ways that extended far beyond their immediate circumstances. The quiet retiree who had endured an hour of uncomfortable scrutiny had become something more, a mentor, advisor, an example whose influence would continue to shape naval service long after her own story had become part of military history. Tomorrow would bring another morning walk along the beach, another cup of coffee prepared in the simple routine that had anchored her civilian life, and another day of service that occurred beyond public recognition, but with the satisfaction that came from knowing that her experience continued to contribute to something larger than herself. The transformation from anonymity to recognition had brought Emily Johnson full circle, from classified service through civilian retirement to acknowledged expertise that was finally being used to prepare the next generation of officers for the kind of responsibilities that had defined her own remarkable career. In the distance, the sound of waves against the Virginia beach shore provided the same rhythmic backdrop that had accompanied Emily's morning walks for years. But now those walks carried the weight of reflection on service that had finally found its proper recognition and influence that would continue to ripple through naval operations for generations to come. The story that had begun with a processing center incident had evolved into something much larger, a demonstration that the most important service often occurred in silence, that recognition sometimes came unexpectedly, and that true leadership was best measured not by public acclaim, but by the quiet influence it exercised on those who followed. 20 years after the Memorial Day ceremony, the Naval War College auditorium filled with an energy that transcended the typical academic atmosphere of military education. 200 senior officers from across NATO nations had gathered for what the classified program listed only as Strategic Leadership Symposium, Session 7, but those with appropriate clearances understood they were attending something unprecedented. The first public lecture by Admiral Emily Johnson, RET, about leadership in classified operations. Emily stood at the podium wearing her dress uniform for only the third time since retirement, the 4 stars on her shoulder boards catching the auditorium lights as she surveyed faces representing the current generation of naval leadership. At 72, she carried herself with the same measured dignity that had characterized her presence at the Memorial Day ceremony 2 decades earlier, but now that dignity was enhanced by the accumulated wisdom of years spent translating classified experience into guidance for successive generations of officers. 20 years ago, Emily began, her voice carrying easily across the auditorium despite its conversational tone. I attended a Memorial Day ceremony where I was initially processed as a potential security threat. The officers involved were following proper procedures, but they lacked information that would have changed their assessment of the situation. That morning taught everyone involved, including me, lessons about assumptions, procedures, and the complex relationship between service and recognition that continue to influence how we approach classified operations. Today, the audience included several officers whose careers had been shaped by Emily's mentorship through the classified leadership development program she had helped establish. Captain Sarah Martinez, formerly Ensign Martinez, daughter of the sergeant who had first questioned Emily's documentation, sat in the front row, her own insignia marking her as someone who had risen rapidly through naval intelligence operations. Commander Davidson, the former corporal who had conducted Emily's initial screening, occupied a seat reserved for program graduates whose careers exemplified the principles Emily's teaching had emphasized. Master Chief Romano, now serving as the program's senior enlisted advisor despite her official retirement, watched from the side of the auditorium with the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed Emily's transformation from anonymous retiree to acknowledged expert in classified leadership development. The program had processed over 800 officers during its 20-year existence, each one carrying Emily's insights into assignments that required the kind of strategic thinking and operational discretion that conventional military training struggled to address. The most important lesson from that morning, Emily continued, was not about security procedures or classification protocols, but about grace under pressure. When faced with circumstances that seemed unjust or procedures that appeared unnecessary, the question becomes, how do you respond in ways that maintain both personal dignity and institutional integrity? The lecture continued for 90 minutes, covering topics that ranged from decision-making under incomplete information to managing the psychological challenges of service that could never receive public recognition. Emily's approach combined theoretical frameworks with practical examples drawn from operations that were finally being declassified after decades of secrecy. The audience took notes with the intensity of students who understood they were receiving insights that no academic program could provide. During the question period that followed, a young lieutenant commander from the Royal Navy asked about balancing operational security with the need for recognition that motivated military service. Emily's response revealed thinking that had been refined through 2 decades of reflection on her own experience. Recognition comes in many forms, she said. The most meaningful recognition often comes from knowing that your actions contributed to outcomes that mattered, even if no one outside a small circle ever learns about your role. The officers who processed my documentation 20 years ago received recognition for their professionalism, but not in the form they might have expected. They learned that following proper procedures, even under pressure, was itself a form of leadership that deserved acknowledgement. As the symposium concluded, Emily found herself surrounded by officers seeking additional guidance, contact information, or simply the opportunity to express gratitude for insights that would influence their approach to challenging assignments. The conversations that developed around her were similar to those that had occurred following the original Memorial Day ceremony, but now they carried the weight of accumulated experience and established mentoring relationships that had proven their value through years of practical application. Captain Sarah Martinez approached Emily during the reception following the symposium, her bearing reflecting the confidence that came from successful command of classified operations in volatile regions. Their conversation, conducted in the careful language that classified experience required, revealed how Emily's influence had shaped not just individual careers, but entire approaches to naval strategic operations. Admiral Martinez said, "I wanted you to know that the principles you taught me during my junior officer years have been central to every major decision I've made since then." The emphasis on following procedures while maintaining flexibility, on finding strength and humility, those lessons have guided me through situations that would have been impossible to navigate using conventional leadership training alone. Emily's response reflected the satisfaction that came from seeing theoretical principles applied successfully in practical situations. "Captain, your success validates the importance of preparing officers for the kind of service that occurs beyond public recognition. Your father would be proud of how you've applied those early lessons to increasingly complex responsibilities." The mention of Sergeant Martinez, who had passed away 5 years earlier, brought a moment of shared reflection on the ways that individual encounters could influence entire career trajectories. Sarah Martinez had requested assignment to classified operations, specifically because of insights gained through her father's stories. about the processing center incident, and her subsequent success had demonstrated the value of seeking service that extended beyond conventional military recognition. Commander Davidson joined their conversation with the quiet confidence that had replaced his earlier earnestness through years of experience in classified security operations. His career had been shaped by the lesson learned during Emily's screening, that true authority often disguised itself as humility, and that the most important service frequently occurred in silence. His current assignment involved managing security for operations similar to those Emily had commanded during her active duty career. Admiral Davidson said, "I've been thinking about how the morning 20 years ago continues to influence the way I approach complex security situations. The patience you demonstrated while we figured out who you were, that's become my standard for how to handle circumstances where procedures seem inadequate but must still be followed." Emily's conversation with Davidson revealed one of the most significant outcomes of the Memorial Day incident: the way that single encounters could reshape entire approaches to military professionalism. Davidson's emphasis on procedural integrity, combined with human dignity, had become a model for security operations throughout the Navy, influencing training programs and operational protocols in ways that extended far beyond his individual assignment. As the reception continued, Emily found herself engaged in conversations that revealed the breadth of influence that her teaching had achieved across multiple generations of naval officers. The Classified Leadership Development Program had expanded beyond the Navy to include officers from all service branches, and its principles were being adapted for civilian agencies dealing with classified operations. The morning that had begun with bureaucratic confusion had evolved into systematic preparation for the kind of service that democracy required, but could rarely acknowledge publicly. 20-5 years after the Memorial Day ceremony, invitation from the President of the United States had arrived through channels so secure that even Emily's extensive security clearance required verification before she could read the contents. The letter, bearing the presidential seal and written in language that carefully balanced recognition with ongoing classification requirements, requested her presence at a White House ceremony honoring service members whose contributions had remained classified for national security reasons. Emily stood in the East Room wearing her dress uniform, now bearing additional decorations that had been awarded through classified channels during her retirement years. The ceremony itself was small, limited to fewer than 50 people whose service had required the kind of secrecy that prevented traditional recognition. The assembled group included officers from all service branches, civilian intelligence personnel, and diplomatic officials whose careers had involved operations that would never appear in public histories. The President's remarks, carefully scripted to acknowledge classified service without revealing operational details, carried special significance for Emily and the other honorees. The service we recognize today represents the highest traditions of military and civilian dedication to national security. These individuals made decisions and accepted responsibilities that required them to find satisfaction in service itself, rather than in public recognition of their contributions. When Emily's name was called and she stepped forward to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the citation read aloud included only the most general references to her service, for distinguished leadership in naval operations requiring the highest levels of strategic thinking and operational discretion, and for continued service to national security through the development of future military leaders. The carefully chosen language acknowledged her contributions, while maintaining the secrecy that continued to protect ongoing operations. As Emily shook hands with the President, their brief conversation revealed the continuing relevance of her expertise to current national security challenges. Admiral Johnson, I'm told that officers trained through your program have been instrumental in recent operations that I can't discuss publicly, but which have prevented conflicts that could have destabilized entire regions. Your influence continues to protect American interests in ways that most people will never know about. Emily's response was characteristically measured. Mr. President, the real credit belongs to the officers who are currently serving in those capacities. My role has been simply to help them understand that the most important service often occurs in silence, and that such service requires different kinds of preparation than conventional military training provides. The White House ceremony represented the culmination of recognition that had begun with the Memorial Day Processing Center incident 25 years earlier. But for Emily, the most meaningful aspect of the day was not the presidential recognition, but the opportunity to see how the principles developed through her teaching had influenced officers who were now assuming the highest levels of responsibility for national security. Operations. 30 years after the Memorial Day ceremony, Virginia Beach apartment that had served as Emily's retreat from public life had been transformed into something approaching a private command center for classified mentorship. The simple living space now included secure communication equipment that allowed her to provide guidance to officers deployed in sensitive operations around the world. The walls that had once been largely bare now displayed photographs from ceremonies honoring service that could finally be acknowledged, and letters of gratitude from officials whose names appeared in history books. But the most significant change was the addition of a guest room that accommodated the steady stream of officers seeking Emily's guidance before assuming command responsibilities in classified operations. The informal mentoring that had begun with individual conversations had evolved into systematic preparation that complemented official training programs. Officers would spend days or weeks in Emily's apartment, learning to balance operational requirements with personal integrity, strategic thinking with human compassion, and the demands of secrecy with the need for meaningful service. On this particular morning, exactly 30 years after the Memorial Day ceremony that had changed everything, Emily prepared for a visit from Admiral Martinez, who had been selected for promotion to flag rank and assignment as Director of Naval Strategic Operations, the same position Emily had held during her most sensitive active duty operations. The symmetry was not coincidental. Emily's influence on Martinez's career had been carefully cultivated through decades of mentorship, designed to prepare her for exactly this responsibility. As Emily set the table for breakfast with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized her approach to military planning, she reflected on how the morning 30 years earlier had initiated a chain of influence that would continue long after her own retirement from even advisory roles. The lesson learned during that processing center confusion that grace under pressure could be more powerful than authority asserted had become central to naval leadership development and would shape military service for generations to come. Admiral Martinez arrived precisely on time, her bearing reflecting the confidence that came from successful command of the most sensitive naval operations. But underlying that confidence was the humility that Emily's teaching had emphasized, the understanding that the most important service often occurred beyond public recognition, and that such service required leaders who could find satisfaction in contribution rather than acclaim. Their conversation over breakfast ranged across 3 decades of military evolution, from the classified operations that had defined Emily's career to the current challenges facing officers who must navigate international tensions while maintaining operational secrecy. But the underlying theme was continuity, the way that principles of leadership under pressure, decision-making with incomplete information, and grace in the face of misunderstanding continued to be relevant regardless of changing technology or evolving threats. Admiral Johnson, Martinez said as their breakfast concluded, "I want you to know that every major decision I'll make in this new assignment will be guided by principles you taught me, beginning with our first conversation when I was a junior officer. The emphasis on procedure balanced with flexibility, on finding strength through humility, those lessons have become part of who I am as an officer and as a person. Emily's response reflected the satisfaction that came from seeing principles successfully transmitted across generations. Admiral Martinez, your success validates the importance of preparing officers for service that extends beyond conventional recognition. Your father would be proud of how you've applied those early lessons to increasingly complex responsibilities. As Martinez prepared to leave for Washington and the assumption of duties that would require her to make decisions affecting global maritime security, Emily walked with her to the apartment door. The morning sun streaming through the windows carried the same quality of light that had illuminated the processing center 30 years earlier. But now that light seemed to symbolize the way that understanding could emerge from confusion, recognition from anonymity, and influence from service that initially appeared to go unnoticed. The most important thing to remember, Emily said as they stood in the doorway, is that the service you're about to undertake will be evaluated not by public recognition, but by outcomes that may remain classified for decades. Find your satisfaction in knowing that your decisions will protect people who will never know your name, prevent conflicts that will never be reported, and maintain stability that will allow others to live their lives without understanding how much their security depends on decisions made in silence. As Admiral Martinez walked toward her official car, Emily remained in the doorway watching the beginning of another chapter in the continuing story that had started with a simple processing center incident. The quiet retiree who had endured an hour of uncomfortable scrutiny had become the architect of an approach to classified leadership that would influence military service for generations to come. The white rose she had carried to the Memorial Day ceremony 30 years earlier had withered and been replaced by thousands of others, but its symbolic significance had grown beyond anything Emily could have anticipated. The gesture of remembrance had become a catalyst for systematic preparation of officers who would serve in the most sensitive positions, protecting national security through decisions that would never receive public recognition, but would determine the course of history. As Emily closed her apartment door and prepared for another morning walk along the Virginia beach shore, she carried with her the knowledge that recognition, when it finally came, brought responsibilities that extended far beyond personal satisfaction. The transformation from anonymity to acknowledged expertise had created opportunities to influence military service in ways that would protect American interests. Long after her own story had become part of classified history, waves against the shore provided the same rhythmic backdrop that had accompanied her morning walks for 3 decades. But now those walks carried the weight of reflection on influence that had shaped an entire generation of military leaders. The story that had begun with bureaucratic confusion had evolved into systematic preparation for the kind of service that democracy required, but could rarely acknowledge publicly. Tomorrow would bring another morning walk, another opportunity to provide guidance to officers preparing for classified responsibilities, and another day of service that occurred beyond public recognition, but with the satisfaction that came from knowing that her experience continued to contribute to something larger than herself. The recognition that had come slowly and unexpectedly had created opportunities to influence military service in ways that would continue long after her own remarkable career had become part of history. In the distance, a naval vessel moved across the horizon, its crew unaware that their mission was made possible by strategic planning that reflected principles developed through 3 decades of reflection on a single morning when assumptions had collided with reality. The ripple effects of that Memorial Day ceremony continued to influence military operations around the world, demonstrating that the most important service often began with the simplest recognition that appearances could be deceiving, that assumptions were dangerous, and that grace under pressure was both a professional skill and a personal virtue that could reshape the world. This story of recognition and hidden service shows how appearances can deceive and true leadership often goes unnoticed. Creating these in-depth military stories takes considerable time and research. If you enjoyed Admiral Johnson's story, please like this video, share it with fellow military story enthusiasts, and subscribe to our channel. Ring the bell icon to never miss our latest stories about the remarkable men and women who serve.